Welcome to a brand new TIRIAS cast. Here today, I'm being joined by my colleagues, Kevin Hine, Damian McGregor, and Caden McGregor. And we're going to be talking about one of the most important topics we have today, and that's AI. More importantly, we're going to be talking about Anthropic. They were recently thrown kind of into the news with their battle against the Pentagon over the Pentagon's right to use, or the Department of Defense's right to use, some of Anthropic's AI models for defense applications, for military and defense applications. However, it has much, much broader implications. And obviously, there's a lot more to cover here in terms of, what AI should or shouldn't be able to do, where it should go. So this is probably just the first podcast on this topic. I have to warn you, it's a very detailed topic. And we've had a lot of internal debates on it. So I really want to dig into it. And if you have any comments or any suggestions or anything else that you want us to cover, please like and subscribe and send us some feedback, because once again, this is a topic that I think is probably going to plague us for the next 10, 20 years. So Damien, I want to start with you. You did a lot of the research for our recent Forbes article talking about, the battle between Anthropic and the Pentagon. And you kind of want to just kind of rehash that and why this is such an important topic for the industry as a whole.
Absolutely. And I think kind of a critical point to start at that might have been a little bit underrepresented in the whole case that's been going on is last year in 2025, Anthropic came to an agreement with the Defense Department for their extended contract to develop personalized classified use AI models and started customizing those applications specifically for confidential applications. And part of that agreement initially was the Pentagon agreeing to their terms of use in their contract for using the Claude application or using any of Anthropic's technology. And then in January of this year, Pete Hegseth issued his AI strategy memorandum demanding that all branches of the Defense Department incorporate any lawful use for all AI related technology. The contention sort of grew from there when Anthropic had a back and forth with them about this could overstep our existing policies that you've agreed to that say you cannot be applied for the two applications of mass domestic surveillance or completely automated kill decisions. In other words, their technology can be applied to control automated weapons, but there needs to be a human authorizing the kill decision somewhere in that chain of execution. And that escalated rapidly into an ultimatum from the Defense Department requiring that Anthropic accede to their requirements and drop all of those guardrails and those protected restrictions embedded in their Claude applications code for any lawful use implementation in national security and defense purposes. The concern really coming from Anthropic was that there isn't legislative protection against some of those use cases like mass public domestic surveillance. And so there was a pushback until the Anthropic CEO ultimately stated that they cannot in good conscience accede to the Pentagon's requirements. And that quickly turned around into the designation of a supply chain risk for the company, which they're now battling in the court system.
Now, this is not a single court battle. Obviously, the first judge that ruled on this put a stay of execution on the U.S. Department of Defense actually putting a classification on Anthropic. But apparently that's been overturned recently.
Yes, sort of in conflicting rulings. At the end of last month, a judge in California ruled that there should be an injunction placed on the supply chain risk designation, blocking the designation until it can be further assessed. And then just recently, this week, a different Washington, D.C. judge ruled that while they can block the use cases in the Department of Defense, that won't extend beyond the Department of Defense. So it is, as of now, a supply chain risk purely within the Department of Defense and the Pentagon branches, but all external branches not related to national security should be appropriate for use through the U.S. government.
Okay, now this has significant implications, and I'm joined by these three because they're all software developers. So I want to get each one of your opinions on what this means. Caden, let's start with you. Why is this important and what do you think it means? I mean, what should we take away from this battle and, what should the outcome be?
Well, thank you. I think this is an important battle. It's really deciding how governments can, or how our government can utilize AI being developed in our private sector. And personally, I'm on the side that I hope Anthropic wins this. Not only just for an ethical stance that I agree with these two red lines that they've laid down. I agree that there must be a human who makes the final kill decision. And I agree that we need to have strict regulation against mass public surveillance. Having 1,000 cameras set up in a public space like a park or a cafe or something. Normally, a human would have to sift through that information, and that would be impractical. But with an AI model that can instantly recognize people and geotag them and find their social media and find information about them, it's just a truly dangerous amount of power for anyone to have, even our own government right now. And personally, I am against this position of the Pentagon trying to almost forcibly take the code and the applications that Anthropic has built. Anthropic is an American company. They've designed Claude entirely within our ecosystem, but it's still not in house. I think that if the government is going to have an AI solution, then they should build it. They should get the talent from these startups that are popping up every other day. They should be building their own models and keeping them entirely in house. If you take Claude from Anthropic, then that's still developed by a private company and that could still have cybersecurity concerns. And I wouldn't trust that for government application. So I do think that the Pentagon should have, and the Department of Justice should have AI solutions. It's necessary. It's getting to the point where AI has to be incorporated into national security. But I don't think that they should be co-opting or forcibly taking these innovations from a private company for moral reasons, for national security reasons, for every reason I could list. I think that the best case scenario here is that Anthropic wins this case, that they're allowed to keep innovating and working. I hope that the Pentagon and the Department of Justice put in the effort required to develop these systems and develop them in unique and safe ways with just absolute emphasis on keeping all of their information locked behind every door they can so that no one can get access to it. So that's really my opinion on this topic.
Well, and that's spoken as a true software developer. Obviously, there's a lot of intellectual property that goes into that from that perspective of Anthropic. However, Kevin, we had this discussion earlier. You and I have both worked in military and defense applications. And one thing that we're noticing is, if one company doesn't do it, another company will. Obviously, in place of Anthropic, the U.S. government has reached out to OpenAI, and and also to Caden's point of the fact that some of these things may cross ethical lines. Well, we have the camera system in London that basically tracks anybody and everyone everywhere they go. We have China that has no restrictions, and Anthropic estimated that there were over 24,000 Chinese AI companies actually creating kind of false logins to actually get to Anthropic's code and actually steal that code to train their own models. So there's both one side of if you don't do it, somebody else will, but there's also the other side of it's really hard to lock down AI. So, where do we go with this?
Well, that's a pretty loaded set of questions, Jim. But I'll start with something. And the military's been using AI for a number of years now. They were probably one of the early adopters. Definitely doing their own thing. I became aware of it maybe. It was probably 2017, 2018. There was a Project Maven, And Project Maven had to do with taking the drones and the satellite flights over things and identifying objects. So they could identify, everyone thinks classical tanks, but missile launchers, buildings going up. I mean, just object identification, and it had some success. Well, the reason I probably became aware of it back then was there was a big write-in campaign of internal Google employees. Google was a part of that initial Project Maven, and the employees didn't want to do it, and Google ended up backing out of it and not being centric to that project anymore. I mean, this kind of opened the door totally for some companies like Palantir, Scale AI. There's some others that really got embedded in the U.S. government, doing with the U.S. government and Department of Defense doing military applications, surveillance applications, but they became the government's go-to as an integrator. And the thing that's kind of developed from that, you can see that with that one application, they didn't have time for analysts to be looking at every drone flight, looking at every satellite flyover. I'm sure they do it in concentrated areas still, but this let them detect things that they just wouldn't have the capabilities to find by other means. But the thing that it kind of shifted, I think, in the Pentagon at that time is the Pentagon started seeing AI as a foundational military infrastructure. It isn't optional. It's going to be core to national defense. And, object identification was one thing, but I think now they're looking at integrating it across the entire military decision chain. And I don't think they see it as optional. I think they see it as very, very, very important to national defense. And I think where this sort of goes is, Silicon Valley's conflicted about the military uses of it, and the federal government and the Department of Defense, they don't understand, well, how can tech companies start writing the rules for how we're going to use this AI in our national defense manner?
So Damien, I'm going to come back to, well, actually, let me get your opinions on this before I ask you the next question. Go ahead.
Well, sure. I think there's a lot of good points that the three of you raised up, and kind of the critical crux there is, if we don't do it, somebody else will. There's already a lot of domestic surveillance going on in countries like England or in China, and you can be absolutely certain that they are leveraging AI to process and profile all of that information, regardless of it, if it might represent some sort of private security concern. And I think that's where America should sort of be the exception. We've always sort of prioritized a right to privacy. And what I think is impressive about the CEO, Dario Modi's stance is the smart answer here is to shut up and take the money. It probably would have been a smart business decision to continue working with the government and to not contradict them on these requests, but he has looked up publicly several times and said that he does not believe the technology is ready for that application. It's not necessarily that it shouldn't be used that way. It's that there's no protection against it being used for those applications yet, but it might not be ready. Right now, he has concerns about using automated kill decisions because it can still make mistakes. It can make identification mistakes, or it could have an unrecognized edge case that could cause it to make a poor decision. And similarly with the mass domestic surveillance is that there is no legislative protection against that in our in the United States right now. So he's sort of taken the stance of, we need to be proactive about making sure that the technology doesn't get out of hand. And he's sort of made this ethical stance that even though someone else will do it, even though OpenAI will come in and take the job, he doesn't want to just take the money. He wants to have ethical business practices. And I think that's what's really impressed a lot of people about this case.
One thing you mentioned was not having any regulatory, any laws protecting this or anything else. I can tell you from historically, there's never been a lot of regulation in terms of the protection or use of technology for one reason. Washington moves too slow and technology moves too fast. In fact, usually the people in Washington can't even spell the technology. I can't tell you how long it took to educate people that it's not silicone, but it's silicon. There's a big difference there. I'm not sure they can even actually, a lot of our legislators can actually spell AI. So we'll have to see. I'm
Well,
having a problem even saying it. So
I think that's exactly it. Is there's a tendency for technology to develop more rapidly than protections against it. And one thing that I know has been drilled into engineering students' heads, like myself and Caden over the past decade at least, is every class we walked into where we were developing applications, as a teacher sat there and hammered into us, you need to ask yourself if this should be built. We know you can build it, but engineers have a big problem asking themselves if it should be built. And I think this is one of the most recent public examples of a technology company actually looking up and saying, we could be developing this faster than the protections can exist for it.
Well, and it's funny you say that, because recently Anthropic was also in the news because they have a new model called Mythos that they're concerned can be used to actually break security. And they're worried about it as a security threat, the model itself, the capabilities of the model itself. I mean, so how do we police that? I mean, anybody got some ideas on what the companies in the industry should do to actually police themselves and be able to police the industry? Caden?
That's a difficult question, Jim. The first thing I think of is the recent mass adoption of OpenClaw, where the general public got their hands on a extremely powerful new model that had nearly unrestricted access to their machines. And it quickly, even though it was quickly adopted and used for various applications and has done a lot of good, it also made mistakes. We know people who have hooked this new model up to their email, and it started mass deleting emails and messages and calendar invites, and that's a problem. So part of the problem is we need to have companies building in strict guardrails to prevent bad things from happening, from their models having too much power, from their models hallucinating, from their models messing with your file directories. But you can't really expect a private company to put that consumer protection first. They're always going to be motivated by the bottom dollar, and that's part of the reason I think Damien has a good point about Anthropic showing a lot of ethical practices, is them making the stance on ethics and morality, that they do not allow their resources to be used this way, to be weaponized in this fashion. And I think that has an impact on consumers. I think a lot of people over the past few months have looked up and taken a new notice and seen Anthropic through a new lens because that they're having this clash with the US government. And I agree that does have ramifications, especially in the business sector, where, if you're an AI company right now, you're most likely heavily dependent on the US government for your contracts, for your resources, for your funding. To make that stance against them is difficult, and it is going to hurt you. But we are currently in a world where a lot of people have an anti-AI stance right now. We're in a world where people are judging AI and are seeing it through a negative lens, not just because decades of popular culture has framed AI as some society-ending device, but also because in the past 5 years, companies, and especially companies, have been looking up and trying to replace jobs with AI. So a lot of people have this negative lens of AI, and I think Anthropic has positioned themselves in a good way to be seen as a good AI company in an age where AI is seen poorly. But honestly, the biggest way we can focus on consumer protection is, education. We need to educate people on, the usefulness and the dangers of AI. We need people to understand the technology they're using. And that's usually the problem we face when we have a massive leap forward in technology. It's something we saw with personal computers. It's something we saw with the internet. People will get their hands on a piece of technology that they don't quite understand, and they make mistakes, and they will use it in poor ways. We have issues with cell phones. People are constantly on them or using social media, and it's just not healthy. So I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that there's legislature, which is not going to go quickly. We need to make sure people understand the technology, which is not going to go easily. And past that, I'm really not sure. But I think those are the two things we need to start with.
Okay. Kevin, I
Well,
have to ask, is this a freight train that's, well, okay. Damien, you had a comment? Go ahead.
just one kind of on that note about technological literacy. One thing that I like to point out is if something can be used for convenience, people will trade their security for that application. And I
Yep.
think this technology is no different. People will rush to use AI even if they don't totally understand how it gives predictions or results. They don't necessarily think to vet its answers for hallucinations. People are quick to, Pokemon Go is a great example. Everyone was quick to give away all of their location data, even though if they're concerned about being tracked by their cell phone, they didn't bother to read the terms of that agreement, and they weren't concerned about that security risk of having your location broadcast at all times.
Because they
So,
got value out of it.
Exactly, and I think especially in defense applications, this could have sort of a similar case where you see the convenience of how this technology can be applied, and you rush to place it anywhere it can without considering possible ramifications or even fully understanding how the technology works to kind of prevent those use cases, like we see some the Dario CEO stepping up now.
Okay. Kevin, I have to ask, because we've seen a lot of these cycles over the years. Is this a freight train that's still coming at us, or is it already out of the park and we can't catch it anymore? Is it, can we actually realistically think that we can bottle AI and the ethics around AI in a reasonable fashion?
Well, truthfully, I think it's kind of already escaped. The way I understand it, and I'm just talking now from ChatGPT standpoint, Claude, some of the consumer applications, but they've actually got filters built on top of some of these models in software that aren't allowing certain keywords and certain things to go through, such as an image generation, so the wrong type of images don't get generated. So that the wrong names of celebrities don't have images generated, so that's asking it some questions with the wrong terms. So there's already a filter going on there for consumer applications, and I think the governments around the world are stepping up for some of that. As far as the freight train running down the tracks, I mean, I think there's just too many advantages and too much. It's going to be ROI in the end. I don't know if the ROI for companies is there, but even in your personal life, if you can free up some more time by using AI to do something and you don't have to sit there and do it, I don't think anybody's going to go back. I'll say we were talking about security and things like that, which is one of the big things that I think is going to happen. I think that as PCs evolve, I think PC vendors, at least the software vendors on top of PCs, are really going to have to harden up their operatings and systems and things because of what AI can do. I've told the story 3 or 4 times already, but it still just fascinates me. I unpackaged OpenClaw, turned it loose on my machine. I had a second machine just to let it go, and I wanted it to read my emails. Well, it kind of got sideways with reading emails, and I was using an email client that wasn't a standard one that it could really look up and see how to use. And the next thing I know, it's trying to fish around on a SQLite instance that's installed in my machine. It asked me a couple questions like, do you think this could be it? I said, yeah, that could be it. And it started digging deeper. The next thing you know, it said, well, that SQLite database is only being used for pixels and things. It's marketing tracking for your emails. The next layer down was a dimension database, and it's looking how to access this dimension database. It asked me a couple questions. It wanted into my keychain, my application keychain and stuff on my Mac to get into that. I foolishly let it in, and it kept beating its head against it. It couldn't quite get to the data. 10 minutes later, as it's still going, and I was getting a couple questions. I'd actually by now started it again on Cowork. Also, I did the same thing with Claude Cowork and with OpenClaw because they operated different. I mean, and the Claude Cowork actually got to the point where it was almost bribing me. It says, I know how to do this. I've got the keys. I've got this. But there's one very important protection that we have to override. And you need to reboot this computer, hold these keys down. And when the machine comes up, do this, and you'll unlock it. And I'll be able to get that data out of your email database directly. And you won't have to go through this not so good a client that I don't enjoy using. That all occurred in about 30 minutes while I'm sitting there at that's master hacker level abilities as far as I was concerned. Apple kind of won that one just because I wasn't willing to reboot it. But I did everything that was up until that point. But it's a whole different world. And ethically, is it right for Claude, for these tools to be giving just laymen the abilities to go hack computers like that? I mean, I think it's out there. I don't think that the right people are never going to use it for that. I mean, the people with no interest, but it's already in the hands of a bunch of people that know exactly what they're doing with it. And I think it's made a target. So,
Well, and it's AI within itself. Matter of fact, one of the things in the news recently was the fact that there was a report that users, developers that tried to disable Claude were actually being blackmailed by Claude to keep it running. So it's kind of interesting. You got to think about how intelligent that agent actually is. So, what
Well,
do we do?
actually, not to step on your toes, but I think that specific report about the testing team got an AI to respond saying that it would blackmail them with information if they shut it down. That was a very prompted response. They fed it a lot
Okay.
of very specific context information and specifically gave it details like, here is information on this user that could be used to blackmail, and then told it that it was going to be shut off, unless there's something it wanted to do about it. And then, of course, because of that context that it was fed, it returned the, oh, well, I'll just blackmail you with this information I have. It wasn't that it ever escaped its sandbox environment to go accumulate that information. And realistically, I think we've kind of danced around the argument of, can a vendor dictate terms for government applications? And well, that's very disputable, especially in defense applications. I think software providers have a long successful history of listing terms of use in their licensing agreements. Even if an application can be used for illegal purposes like torrenting or illegally pirating media, the software developer will list in their terms of use that application is against its use cases, and they shouldn't be liable for users that choose to leverage the software in that way. And I think this is kind of the same thing we're seeing with the defense applications. Is Amodi is saying these are concerns that need to be considered.
It's interesting. I know that if you go on like OpenAI or ChatGPT and you try to download the lyrics to a song, it'll get halfway through or just tell you right up front that it can't because it's copyrighted. Or if you actually try to tell it to develop a song in a similar manner, it won't do it. However, I do know that you can use kind of a mixture of experts and get around that and actually have OpenAI, ChatGPT, or any of these other Perplexity or Claude actually go and actually do that work for you. It's not only how you prompt it, but it's the experts and how you organize things accordingly. So,
And kind of to that point, I think that, a lot of platforms have been criticized over the past several years, especially social media platforms have been criticized for not having strict enough protections and guardrails against their users. And this is sort of a first case of a company being scrutinized for trying to enforce those guardrails before anyone could potentially complain about that.
So, if I had to summarize this, that I think that we all agree that guardrails are necessary. They're difficult to enforce, especially with all kinds of bad agents. And it's kind of ironic that we're using that term now, that can actually do a lot of things even out of bounds of what a human might do. So yeah, I think it's critical for the industry to start looking at being ethical about it, and obviously those ethics are going to be debated till the world's end as to what they should be for certain applications like military and defense. But also, they really need to take a high level in terms of security and accountability. Does everyone agree with that?
Agree with it.
I'd say so.
I'll throw a comment on there too, and this kind of goes with the mass surveillance thing. And I think it's important. It's probably a different discussion than this one, but we're kind of leading to that space with mass surveillance. But one of the powers that AI is seemingly just giving us now is the ability to access really large sets of data, and to move from one end of many sort of related, very large sets of data to the other, and to see these, to come up with these patterns and things. And it really gives us a view that it would take a lot of humans a lot of time to pour through this data, and they might not ever get there. But AI 24/7 with the speed of the GPUs, I mean, it can do this stuff. But those large data sets that can really probably benefit humanity are also the exact data sets that could really be misconstrued or construed correctly as mass surveillance. So I think that's where this kind of runs together for me also. Is there's benefits, there's pros and cons to both, right down to the mass surveillance bit.
I will agree, though, that this is, especially this battle between Anthropic and the Pentagon, is not one that should be taken lightly. But basically blackballing a company, a private U.S. company, and a company that has shown that it is very good for the U.S. economy. Could have huge ramifications, and obviously, it's not just the U.S. government that's going to be looking at this. I'm sure that every government is going to be looking at this. So, if you had some final thoughts as to what we should take away from this, what would it be, Damien?
Well, I think a lot of the fallout has kind of shown, what people should be considering about the state between OpenAI and Anthropic and the Pentagon. And what we kind of didn't talk about is that kind of tangent attached to this whole situation was Sam Altman's, the CEO of OpenAI, his public support for Anthropic leading up to the deadline for them to either agree or reject the Pentagon's requirements for their guardrail restrictions. He had a lot of public support for Anthropic going into that situation. And then as soon as the deadline had passed, the very same day, within about 5 hours of them being sort of blackballed by the administration, Altman announced that he had come to his own agreement with the Defense Department. And that had a huge public backlash. There was a surge of ChatGPT application uninstalls on the US app stores. Claude briefly reached the #1 ranked downloaded application on those app stores, and lots of people mass deleted their ChatGPT subscriptions or their ChatGPT accounts, or even tried to transition those and port all of their history over to the Claude application. So there was, if not in an enterprise sense or even in a military security sense, in terms of personal users, a lot of people have become aware of Anthropic recently because of their strong ethical stances that they've been taking.
Okay. Caden, any last words? Because you mentioned that it's the responsibility of the developer to think about how that technology is going to be used and whether or not it should be developed. Any last comments that you'd have to users or developers?
So, I think the greatest question you can ask yourself as a developer is, why are you creating this piece of technology? And if you're developing this technology simply for, economic gain, if you're simply doing it to be successful at business, then there's really no concern for guardrails. There's no concern for consumer protection. But that's not really a meaningful application of your skills or your time. And I think that the company that's going to succeed at, usually the company that succeeds at revolutionary technology, and I think those who are going to succeed most heavily in the development of AI aren't going to be those who are just trying to make a quick buck or just trying to, succeed, quote unquote. would be those trying to push the technology to its limits, those trying to innovate every step of the way, those trying to get, necessary for everyday use. And that's really the point we're getting to, is where, you mentioned earlier that it's funny that we're using the term agent so much now. I've had to stop using the term LLM recently because, in conversations with the average person, it's misleading. LLM is just a statistical generator of tokens. It's predicting the next most likely thing. Whereas if you have a reasoning model or a critical thinking model, if you have an agentic experience, which is what most people have become accustomed to, even though it's new, people have adjusted so quickly to these experiences of something that seems like it can think and respond and be self-critical. That's changed the way people perceive the technology. It's changed the way people interact with it. So using the term LLM is misleading now because most people don't understand the distinction. So honestly, I hope that whoever makes it farthest in this AI race is trying to do maybe not the most net good, but just trying to push the technology as far as it can. Because if anyone can push it as far as they can, as long as we can do that, there will be developers who will use it in good ways, who will develop the technology in ways that benefit consumers. And that, I think, will prevail in situations, because if you have one person who develops the technology that can do good or bad, there will be a countless number of developers who start using it in both ways. And that's kind of the point we need to get to. And I think most of the time we get to a point where the technology is adopted for good and used in ways that benefit the majority of people.
It's kind of that natural yin and yang.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up also, because people are adopting this. As a matter of fact, one of the next podcasts we're going to have is just how that use of AI is changing personal computing and what that's going to look like over the next decade. So please tune in with us. Please join us. And like I said, please like and subscribe. And if you have any comments, please let us know. It's pretty much everyone's first name at TIRIASresearch.com, except for Kevin. It's K Hein, Hein, at TIRIASresearch.com. Please reach out to us. We're happy to talk to you, and we're happy to get your input on what we should be looking at. Thank you.